Well, folks, we're going to go ahead and jump into this and get rolling here. I know we've got some more people that will come in. I'm going to share some of what we've been learning this year from the work that we've been doing at Springtide, and then we're going to have a chance for Q&A. So you can feel free to use the Q&A feature down there at the bottom. I mean, I think all of us, or many of us anyway, know how Zoom works by now. For better or worse, and or you can drop them into chat. We've got a couple of Springtide staff members manning. Gosh, how antiquated is that? We've got a couple of Springtide people staffing the chat room, and if you've got questions or if you're having technical difficulties, they can certainly help you out with that. But we'd love to capture your questions as we go along. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we will get rolling here. Let's see if we can get, I've only done this a million times. So let's see if I can get it correct. Oh, I think I did it. Sigrid, can you tell me in the chat if you're seeing my title slide? Oh, fantastic. Okay. Look, everyone, we're good. This is the State of Religion and Young People 2021. This is Springtide's flagship study. We do this every single year. To try and capture what we've been learning and hearing from young people in that given calendar year about their religious and spiritual concerns, their engagement with the divine, their feelings about institutional religion, whether they do or don't go to church or mosque or synagogue, if they engage in some sort of rituals and practices. All of that we want to wrap up into an annual report, and of course, every year is a little bit different. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what we learned last year, and in what we've discovered this year in this first look webinar here. Before we get too far into that, though, for those of you who are new to Springtide, I just want to say a little bit about who we are. Springtide is a research institute that it's national. We focus on 13 to 25-year-olds across the country, and as we sometimes say in a shorthand way, we go wherever they are asking and trying to navigate life's biggest questions. We show up there and we talk to them. We find out what their concerns are, who their influences are, who they're turning to. We pay attention to who they're not paying attention to, and ask questions about that too. We do this all in a very sociological perspective. So we're trying to always dig for the deeper story, the broader lens, contextualize the data points. As we say here in our mission statement, we believe that no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone. So we conduct actionable research to reflect the inner and outer lives of 13 to 25-year-olds in order to help those who care about young people care better. If you're showing up here today, you're almost certainly one of those people who cares about young people, and certainly we cannot and do not need to change how much you care. But sometimes we're working with inaccurate information, and in order to care best, we need to understand really what's going on in the lives of young people. And that's our job at Springtide, is to bring you an accurate understanding of the world that young people inhabit, so that you can see where you might be able to make an impact in their lives, because they really need you. In that first segment, you see that we believe no young person should have to navigate life's most important questions alone, and increasingly that's what they're doing. As we're going to see, and as those of you who have been following along with our work already know probably, young people are just often disconnected from the kinds of institutions that many of us on this call might have grown up with, and the trusted adults that came along with those institutions and acted as guides often feel disconnected from the young people that they would like to impact. And that's because the world has changed, and we need to find new ways of bridging those gaps. At Springtide, the way that we want to do that is through this particular way of doing research that we call data with heart. So yes, we're going to collect a lot of data. You're going to see a lot of data. We have the largest data set in the country about young people's religious and spiritual concerns. But for us, it's more than just interviews and qualitative data, and it's more than just surveys and quantitative data and numbers. We are intensely listening to young people throughout the research process in a number of ways. We have a young person's advisory board. We have a national research advisory board of experts who work with young people and care about them. We have interns, we have a writer in residence program, we have a BIPOC fellowship, and all this is designed at Springtide to make sure that we don't just become a bunch of old people studying young people. We want to be rigorous with our data, but we want to make sure that data has heart. And it's those perspectives that make sure that our data has heart. And we're always feeding back like, hey, what about this question? Could we ask this? Are we understanding these data in the correct way? Those are the overriding concerns that Springtide has, is not just collecting the data in a way that is rigorous, but understanding and then interpreting it and getting it out into the world in a way that young people can see themselves in our data when we tell those stories. And we have a whole lot of data. To date, we've gathered 230 qualitative interviews and 22,000 nearly survey responses and 16 focus groups. Most people get really blown away by the survey number, the 22,000 responses. But of course, if you've ever tried to talk to a young person on the phone, you know it's the 230 qualitative interviews that are far more impressive, as our research team has done just an amazing job over the last couple of years. Really tracking down young people, getting them to talk about their deepest concerns on the phone with a stranger. One of my favorite sitcoms to come out in recent years is Superstore, and there's this line in there from somebody who is one of the actresses from this demographic, and she turns to her friend and she says, I feel like calling someone is like the meanest thing you can do to them. So getting all of these interviews is no small feat. And this year, informing the state of religion in young people is just over 10,000 surveys and about 125 of those 230 interviews that we collected just this year for this study. And if you were here last year, you remember that we offered up this concept of relational authority in the State of Religion in Young People 2020. You can still find this. It's free download on our website, or if you want the physical copy, you can buy it from us or from Amazon, I think for just $10, or maybe even, I think I saw it for $7 at Amazon the other day. And we were able to use the data to drive actionable insights about how to connect and engage with young people in a way that they would find most productive. And that model that emerged out of the quantitative and qualitative data was this thing that we called relational authority, combining listening, transparency, integrity, and care along with expertise to really make a difference, to gain trust, and to move the needle with the young people in your lives. So often adults feel like we have to just come in with the expertise. We have to, and it's not just that we feel like that's our role. Sometimes, I mean, we actually do know what's best for young people. And so we want to tell it to them as soon as we possibly can so their lives can get better. And that makes a lot of sense, except that if we're not doing the listening, transparency, integrity, and care parts, the expertise just really doesn't matter. We don't get through to them. And if we're only doing the listening, transparency, integrity, and care, we're not bringing any expertise to the table, well, young people just sort of dismiss us. We look like friends to them, and they don't need us to be their friends. They were very upfront that they are looking for adults to be adults. And they wanted more trusted adults and need more trusted adults in their lives. And if you're interested in that, of course, you can probably find recordings of me talking about it online somewhere. I've done a lot of that, or you can download the report. And this year, the State of Religion and Young People, which will be out October 22nd, I think it just is coming to us from the printer today, which is exciting. And I can't wait to see it in actual physical form. But this year is all about navigating uncertainty. If you know anything, if you've been doing anything other than hibernating over the last couple of years, you know that uncertainty is the hallmark of what people have been going through. And what's weird about navigating uncertainty through a pandemic is that, especially for young people, like, how do you figure out what's normal and what's not normal? Because uncertainty is always a part of being young. In fact, maybe the defining feature of being young, you could argue, is exploration and curiosity and like trying to figure things out and not really knowing who you are or where you stand, or, you know, maybe even what you should be, what you want to do. Well, that's one thing. Just to be a normal 18, 19, 20-year-old is just one thing. But to do that and not even know if the kind of uncertainty that you're feeling is the kind that you're supposed to be feeling or should be, that's a whole other thing, because we've had this pandemic layered on top of it. And so what we wanted to do this year is really dig into, what does that uncertainty look like in young people's lives? And most importantly, how are they navigating it, especially when it comes to their religious and spiritual concerns? Because so many of the questions that have come to bear over the last year and a half for young people, and for maybe all of us, have been questions that are religious in nature. What is the meaning of all of this? What is the impact of this on my life? What, including like, well, how much should I be consuming? Like, did I just spent a year not shopping or very much? Is that a thing I should keep doing? What's going on with the environment? What role does racial justice play in my life and in the world? And on and on and on. We explored this year through not just questions of values, but also through questions of work and vocation. We explored this through transitions back to school in some of our publications, a new normal and work life. And we're exploring it here specifically with regard to faith. And before we move on into that, I want to give a plug for season 5 of the Voices of Young People podcast. If you follow along with Springtide, you know that every time we release a report, we also have an accompanying season of the podcast, The Voices of Young People, that comes out with it. Our head of community, Marta Awaji, is the producer for this. It's fantastic. I love especially the seasons that come with the state of religion and young people, because it's just a young person talking about how these issues impact their lives and their faith. There's no interviewer voice, and it's a really diverse set of people that are coming at this from a variety of angles. And so for many of us that don't necessarily maybe wouldn't get exposed to a broad array of young people, we get a chance to hear those stories. They'll be coming out, I think they either start this week or next week. I can't remember the exact launch date. Maybe we can get it over there in the chat. And by the way, in the chat, I'm seeing people talk about the ways that they've been using our work and are using our work in their own settings. That's amazing. That's incredibly gratifying. And I'm certainly, we're going to capture those for the team. So thank you. 10/21 is the date of the new podcast release. I see there from Sigrid. Thanks a lot. Anyway, please do give us a like, give us a follow, leave a review of the podcast. That helps other people to find it and discover young people. So look, a lot of the context of this year of navigating uncertainty happens, we can't tell that story without telling the broader context of what's going on in the world. And of course, as those of you who have seen previous presentations know, one of the big things that's been happening in the world for the last 40 or 50 years is this loss of trust in social institutions, not just for adults, as you see here, but also for young people. When this is Springtide's data. At Springtide, all the data that we collect is 13 to 25-year-olds. And even here, nothing really gets above a 5 on a 10-point scale, or very high above a 5 on a 10-point scale. And so that's a key thing that is still happening in young people's lives. It's not like, I know we talked about it in depth last year, but it's not like just because we talked about it, that goes away. That still is an important contextual piece. And going all the way back to Springtide's first study at the beginning of 2020, called Belonging, we explored social isolation among young people, and that still remains the case. Gen Z is the loneliest generation, not just right now, but ever recorded. That is not typically the case. It's usually the oldest cohort that is the loneliest and the most isolated. And for the first time ever, it's young people. And so you've got massive institutional distrust along with social isolation. Those two things are not happening in parallel. They're of course connected. I mean, when you're disconnected from institutions, you end up being disconnected from a lot of people. And we add into that mix data from this year about uncertainty. 40% of young people say that they have experienced trauma in their lives. 62% have experienced a broader term called emotional distress as a result of a challenging event. And 28% reported experiencing a challenging event that was causing them to feel uncertainty when they took our survey. So what that means, and we gave the survey all throughout the year, so what that means essentially is that somewhere about a fourth to a third of young people are experiencing some kind of combination of uncertainty, trauma, stress at any given time. That if you've got 3 or 4 young people in front of you, there's a really good chance that one of them is going through something that needs to be attended to in that exact moment. And there are real spiritual implications of living in this environment. This world that young people are trying to navigate where, among other things, this is not everything that's going on in their lives, but I think these are the 3 like really big hallmark keystone things that are shaping all of the other parts of their lives. Low trust, high isolation, and massive uncertainty. So in the midst of that, of course, they're trying to do all the normal young people things. They're trying to go to school. They're trying to get jobs. They're trying to, form relationships, romantic relationships, friendship relationships. And they're trying to navigate through all of that in what I think are really unprecedented circumstances. It's not uncommon for generations to have to navigate one or maybe two of these things, but it's pretty rare for for an entire generation of young people to have to grow up trying to find their way through this combination of massive things happening all at the same time. So while we might say it's just a thing like a pandemic, underneath the surface of that, there are all these social forces that are running through the currents that are running through their lives. And one of the really encouraging things for us at Springtide to see is that there still remains like fairly high rates of religiosity and spirituality. So you see there roughly 3/4 of young people say that they're religious. 78% of young people say that they're spiritual. Now, of course, the context of that, though, it looks a little bit different. So the majority of young people are religious or spiritual, but what do they believe? And so we asked them to identify with these statements, like which one is the closest to their own reality. And you see, something like 16% of them are functionally falling into this atheist category, that they don't believe in a higher power at all. And 7% are I don't know. But we see over 50% say that they either believe more than they doubt, or that light green 23% saying that they have no doubts that a higher power exists. I find this to be a sort of not astonishing, but I think encouraging that there is at least some sense that, as we talked about last year, the decoupling of these affiliation variables, like, do you identify as Christian, Catholic, Christian, Protestant, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, etc. Just because you're unwilling to check those boxes doesn't mean you don't believe and aren't interested. Because we see about 40+% of young people being unaffiliated. So it's this whole mix where belief is really varied, and also belief and affiliation are not particularly connected. It's also true that belief and connection to a higher power are not necessarily synonymous. So this is, we asked just the young people who said that they believed in a higher power, do you feel connected to that higher power? And you see there, like 1/3 of young people say not at all. Like, yes, I think there is a higher power, but they don't have any personal connection to the divine, which is, I think, a very interesting space to occupy. And probably one that would cause no small amount of cognitive dissonance that I imagine, needing help to try and make it through. That's okay. I mean, one of the things to really understand here is that young people's lives are marked by change, as we noted earlier, and exploration. And so I don't know that this would cause, this pie chart here would cause quite so much concern among young people who are used to sort of living with this notion of both knowing and not knowing, being and becoming, as it would maybe with adults who feel like they need to be formed completely and have figured things out and mostly just live those things out. Young people don't seem to be as bothered by this as adults. So what does that look like when when our young people talk about that? As we noted, we've done a whole lot of interviews, and here's a quote from Viola, who's 17. In real life, then that kind of, those pie charts translate into things like this. Sometimes I found it really hard to identify with Christianity because of other Christians. And I know that's not necessarily right, because people are not always an accurate representation of the whole and of the belief. But I live in a really small town in a rural area, and it can be really discouraging at times to have to identify with part of a church that I really disagree with at times. I don't currently attend a church, but I'll listen to sermons online and stuff, and I do some smaller Bible studies with friends. There's a whole lot going on in these 3 short paragraphs from Viola that I think is worth unpacking throughout the course of this conversation today. And so I want you to sort of keep those things in mind. I mean, what have we got here? We've got a 17-year-old, so a high school student, who is both being self-reflective enough to know that she's engaging in this sort of like, I don't want to be there, even though I know that they're not representative of the faith as a whole, but it still makes it hard for you to engage with the faith as a whole. I mean, that's a level of self-reflection that a lot of adults don't always carry with them. Still being relatively committed to her faith and even to the practices of the faith, despite not being in the institutions or not wanting to identify and affiliate with those institutions. So listening to sermons online, attending Bible studies with friends, etc. I think Viola gives us a good snapshot of what this can look like in real life. On the quantitative side, again, we asked young people, do you try hard to carry your religious beliefs into all of your other dealings in life? And we see a very mixed bag here as well. So 39% of young people disagreed with this statement, 47% agreed, 14% don't even know. So that belief is not necessarily even coupled with action in daily life. Disrupting some of the assumptions that I think we might have about how committed young people are to their faith. That we've got this 47% of young people who are agreeing with that. But this was challenged during the pandemic. There was a real, the pandemic brought with it a real opportunity, but also some real troubles when it came to figuring out how to engage young people in conversations about religion. And we wrote this entire guide called The New Normal. You can see it behind me. We felt really good about that subtitle, about calling it the 8 ways to engage with Gen Z in a post-pandemic world. We felt good about that post-pandemic language when we wrote that subtitle in February, marketing this as a back-to-school guide. And of course, we're still in the pandemic. Nevertheless, the exercises in empathy there that Ellen, our head writer, came up with are fantastic. And they really help to connect our experiences with young people's experiences through the data and what young people are telling us. And one of the things that we were really encouraged by is that young people's faith, at least for the first year and a half of the pandemic, seems to be doing okay. 47% say that their faith remains steady, and then about a split, about half of the remaining saying that they are doubting their faith more or lost their faith completely, and some saying that it got stronger. I get concerned about how long can that hold before it starts to slip without institutional support. So with the pandemic still coming in these fits and starts about who's comfortable showing up in which places and how, and with social distancing still being around, and with the Delta variant bringing it back, and who knows what other variants coming down the pike. But at least for now, it has not been catastrophic. In terms of people's faith, it's been catastrophic in so many ways. I don't mean to short sell it there, but it has not been catastrophic in terms of the bottom falling out on young people's faith lives. And so I think we can take some heart that just because young people are increasingly exploring and living faith outside of institutions doesn't mean that it's necessarily unsustainable, at least for short periods of time. And Yadi says it this way. He says, faith teaches you that no matter what happens, everything's going to be okay. And faith itself can really pull you through. And it gives us something to look forward to, a destination. And I just feel like it's very, very important. Really, some of these key ways of making it through all this uncertainty, that it's going to be okay. We are going to pull through this. And we saw this when we asked young people explicitly about uncertainty. Well, the majority of them are concerned about it. They are also confident. So they are, it's like something like 2/3 of young people are very concerned about the levels of stress and uncertainty in their life. And about the same amount of people are also confident that it will be okay. They are going to find their way through it, which speaks, I think, to their resilience. But all of this navigation and outside of institutions and this sort of cognitive dissonance between believing but not always knowing where to put that belief, or sort of exploring and not even necessarily knowing where to put that exploration, has real spiritual implications, because that work is often being done alone. So we asked young people, when you felt overwhelmed and didn't know what to do about something, who did you turn to for help? Now, not surprisingly, friends and family show up at the top. I don't think that's ever going to change. We've got decades of research from social scientists, as well as other research institutes, to show how important families are and remain in young people's lives. I mean, parents are still, to the extent that parents are intact and present in young people's lives, they are still the single greatest source of influence, and friends being, a close second there. But we used to think of religious communities as playing this really important role, and young people just don't see religious communities as being the people that they should turn to anymore. You see, there is often likely to turn to nobody to help them navigate a stressful time, as they are to turn to somebody from their faith community. About 16% of them selected those. They could have picked all these options. It's not like they had to pick one or just the other. And we see teachers outranking somebody from their faith community. I don't think this is inherently a problem in the sense that like all those are good people, like your friends are good people, your parents are good people, your teachers are good people. But if we're talking about trying to make it through a world with that is like forcing real existential kinds of questions about the meaning of life, like the one that young people are living in right now, and they're not turning to faith leaders, well, then I do think that that's a problem. I mean, teachers are great. They don't do the same things that faith leaders do. Parents are great. They don't do the same things that faith leaders do. There's no reason why all these numbers couldn't be high. They did, again, they could have picked every one of them. And so I think that's where we start to see some of this erosion in the foundation. When we ask young people why not turn to a faith leader? A lot of this came down to values. So we're going to talk a little bit about this disconnect here that young people see between themselves and religious people and religious leaders. We ask them, how much do you care one of the things we ask them is, how much do you care about these particular issues? And you see that there, their level of care in the light green bar on top. And then we ask them, how much do you think religious people care about these issues? And you see their answer there in the dark green bar for each of these topics. And then that orange bar documents the disconnect for each of these. So you see there's a 27% disconnect, a 27-point disconnect for LGBTQA+ rights, a 25% disconnect, 25-point disconnect for gender equity, and on and on. In other words, young people are running around the country thinking like, I care a lot about gender equity, LGBTQ+ rights, immigration rights, income inequality, disability rights, environmental causes, reproductive rights, racial justice, Black Lives Matter, gun reform, and on. They don't think that religious people care about those things, any of those things, to the same level that they care about those things. And so when we interview and talk to young people about this, these topics come up time and time again. And they end up saying things like, well, we're living in different worlds. Like they aren't concerned with the same things I'm concerned with. And you begin to understand then, like if you're experiencing a lot of angst or a lot of anxiety, or if you're trying to navigate something that you don't know how to navigate, you're not probably inclined to turn to somebody that you don't think shares the same values that you do. One of the, I think, big caveats that needs to be expressed here is that this is their perception of what religious leaders care about. I don't think this is an objective reality. I wouldn't say that only 51% of religious leaders care about gun reform. I don't actually know what that number is. But the importance in terms of being able to predict or understand why young people are not turning to religious leaders, the importance isn't whether they've accurately assessed the degree to which religious people care about each of these issues. The importance is that this is how they perceive the world. There's an old saying in my field of sociology, in my discipline, that which people perceive as real is real in its consequences. And so this is the understanding that you have of the world. Of course, you're not turning to these people. Lily explains it here, not through a values perspective, but through an experience perspective.
Young people don't feel that churches value the same things as them. And they don't, like for me, I don't feel like the things going on in my life, I can turn to a religious leader and they'll understand, because a lot of the Catholic leaders and such don't go through the same things I do. So that's kind of where I saw the disconnect within myself. And I think a lot of young people, especially Gen Z, kind of take it upon themselves to find what works for them, and they do it by themselves at their own time, and they're not doing it with an organization. Communities that I'm part of, dance, school, the worries that I have, the things that cause my own uncertainty, I don't see religious leaders kind of understanding that or facing the same things.
So Lily is one of our, she's one of what's in this program called the Springtide Ambassadors Program. And these are the young people we meet with monthly, and you're gonna hear from a couple of more of them as we move on. But I think Lily has this really nice way of saying it. Like, you know, I mean, she's young and she's trying to, like, if you don't get what the pressures are like in my life, like I don't assume that you would. And if you're not demonstrating that you do, then you're probably just not even on my radar, essentially. Ethan, then talking about this through not just activities, but through identities, puts it this way. He says, I'm gay, and I know that the conservative Christian community doesn't necessarily support people who are LGBTQ+. And a lot of the beliefs were written by members of the religion who don't necessarily respect these people. And so it's made me question to what extent I can really trust that this is what I should believe, that it is ethical or proper. And for that reason, I've kind of lost faith, because I just feel like there's not a lot of trust I can place in the religion when there's a lot of hypocrisy and contradictions. So Ethan is pulling out sort of some very common and tried and true sources of frustration with religious people, but through his own experience, lens, and identity, which makes them even more personal. Oscar, another one of our ambassadors, I think has this really great way of summing up that particular kind of exclusion.
I think that's the most interesting aspect of all of this, because that's a trend that I've seen in our generations through a lot of different things, just like a distrust of institutions, corporations, governments, whatever. But religion kind of has a special place in that, right? Because it permeates everything else. It's like something that applies to all of life, whereas governments are particular things, corporations are particular things, but religion's kind of like in all of it. So it has a much greater effect, I guess, or influence on every aspect of life. And if you feel excluded, then you feel that exclusion that much more in an institution.
Do you hear that last part? Like Oscar's, I think, saying this so well, saying like it's not the same as being left out at school, although that wouldn't be great. And it's not the same as being left out of politics, although that wouldn't be great. When you're left out of or excluded by religious institutions, it's more damaging, because that's the thing that cuts through all of the other things. Young people told us this in interviews all the time without being able to necessarily identify it in exactly the way Oscar has, that it calls into question your own self-worth, because you're trying to reject an entire belief system or trying to figure out if you should reject an entire belief system that has rejected you, or doesn't understand you, or doesn't seem to be making an attempt to know you. Instead seems to be really concerned with making sure that you know them. It's a tough place to be than just saying like, oh, I don't feel welcome at work, right? None of those are great. But as Oscar points out, this has a more pervasive effect. So what happens then is that we've got young people standing over here. They don't even know how to engage sometimes with the faith community. Even when they recognize that they're asking religious questions, they don't even know how to get to religious answers. 51% of young people say that they don't know how to get connected to a faith community, even if they'd like to. 40% of the young people who identified as very religious, so they check the box saying that they're very religious, less than half of them told us that they found connecting with their faith community helpful during challenging or uncertain times. So again, this is just the people who are like fervent believers, very religious, and even they are not finding their communities to be helpful navigating uncertainty. And almost 50% of young people tell us that they don't turn to faith communities due to a lack of trust, which you've already seen earlier. Essentially, if you wrap all of this up, what have we got? Well, we've got a whole bunch of young people saying, gosh, it would be really great to be connected to somebody who could help me get through these times, but I'm not doing it over there. I'm not doing it in those religious settings for this whole host of reasons. Some of them, again, may be objectively true, may not be objectively true, but subjectively, that is their perception and that is governing their feelings. Almost like metaphorically, what they're saying is like, I'm interested in this conversation. I still have high rates of belief. I'm still interested, as we saw even last year, like there's high levels of prayer and spirituality and all kinds of things. And I need you, but I'm just not willing to walk across that threshold, real or metaphorical, of your church or your mosque or your campus ministry, of your Bible study, etc. And we've got on the other side of that divide, I think, a whole bunch of religious institutions and systems that care genuinely and deeply about the lives of young people. And the people who staff those places want nothing more than to connect with young people. But we've built those systems for a world that has high institutional trust, where people are relatively connected and life is somewhat predictable. In other words, the opposite of the world that young people inhabit now. And so it's basically like we're sitting on the other side of that divide saying, like, we've got everything for you that you could possibly want, where we would love to chat with you. We definitely want to meet you. I want to know more about you. I genuinely care about your well-being. All you have to do is just walk across the threshold of this door. You see what I'm saying? Like, we've got a whole bunch of young people saying, the one thing I don't want to do is this, and a whole bunch of like well-meaning adults saying, basically, we've constructed the system so that you get access to all of this as soon as you do that one thing. And we're not doing, I don't think that's young people's job. That's not incumbent upon teenagers to figure out how to make that transition. It's our job. It's adults' job to do that work. And we are often just not doing that work. We talked about the pandemic earlier. We surveyed young people in the opening weeks of the pandemic, the opening weeks, like it's a premiere of a movie, in the first weeks of the pandemic. And we were startled to learn that in those first weeks of lockdowns, 2% of young people had been reached out to by a religious leader. And so we were so concerned by that number that we figured we better check back in on it a year later. So we surveyed then again in February of this year, 2021, and asked young people the same question. Again, they could check all that apply here. If anyone outside your home has reached out to you personally, who was it? And only 10% of young people told us that they had been reached out to personally by a faith or religious leader. That's not bridging the divide. Like that's not going to get us across the disconnect. In response to this then, where young people feel like they are trying to do religious work without religious guides and with systems that they cannot trust, they have developed what we call this faith unbundled. And faith unbundled is one of the big themes that we explore in the State of Religion and Young People this year. And as their faith gets unbundled, it looks differently. What does it look like to unbundle belief from a single source or system? Well, it looks like young people who turn to many or various sources when making meaning and discerning what to believe about right and wrong, purpose and calling, salvation and suffering, and more. It looks like curiosity. It looks like curiosity. This is a hallmark of how young people are thinking about faith. If you're not allowed to be curious, encouraged to be curious, then they're not seeing that as authentic faith exploration. But of course, faith is just more than belief. Faith implies practice as well. And what does it look like to unbundle practices from a single source or system? Well, it looks like young people who blend various rituals and behaviors to suit and make sense of the current questions that they are facing. It looks like flexibility. So a lot of the rituals that we may think of as being deeply connected to questions that people ask in their lives, young people might not necessarily see those rituals and make that connection, but they are interested in rituals and practices. They are interested in bringing things together. We wrote an article that some of you may have seen. It was in the Washington Post over the summer. And the whole time I used to I had this very containered version of faith, thinking that oh, of course, some young people are into things like tarot card reading and crystals, and some young people are into institutional religion like Christianity or Islam or what have you. And what we wrote about, because what our data are actually showing is that it's not crystals or Christianity, it's crystals and Christianity, which is fascinating and maybe troubling to some of you on this call. But it's not. This unbundled faith for young people means the combination of practices. And when we start looking at the other aspects of faith lives that are being removed from a single source or system, one of those is community. So what does it look like to unbundle community from a single source? Well, it looks like young people who show up where trusted personal relationships exist or new ones seem possible. Young people who are willing to forego participation in communities lacking those qualities, even if they have had long-term associations with those communities. It looks like connection. The communities are fine, but for faith exploration, communities tend to be relatively homogenous, and what young people are looking for is a connection to others. And of course, a lot of this runs through and connects with the most diverse generation that's ever existed, and one for whom diversity, equity, and inclusion are not just things that resonate with them personally, but they are of their highest values, as we explored in meaning making. And what does it look like then to unbundle identity from a single source or system? Instead of just saying I am X or I am Y, breaking all those things apart, it looks like young people who are unwilling to shed parts of themselves so that they can fit into a prescribed narrative about who and how and what to be in the world. It looks like wholeness. And it looks like Zaina. Let's hear Zaina talk about faith unbundled.
Due to Gen Z's awareness of social issues, specifically like awareness of the issues within a lot of institutions and a lot of churches and things like that, it kind of makes us less open to the idea of being a part of these institutions. I think a lot of like being a part of like a religious institution or a church or like a mosque or something like that for our parents was kind of more of like a generational thing, and we're kind of breaking away from that and forming our own sense of morality and our own faith based off of our experience, just kind of living and hearing other people's experiences. For me personally, like kind of grabbing different parts of different religions. I know a lot of other people because they kind of talked about that too. And kind of mixing religions or like moral codes from different religions or bases, like different, like just basic principles from a lot of different religions or a lot of different spiritualities. I think Gen Z specifically is doing that a lot more often and kind of creating like their own faith. And I think spirituality varies. Every young person you're going to talk to, you're going to get a different answer about what they believe in.
That's some really complicated stuff Zaina is trying to work through in there, and she's doing such a nice job of explaining what faith unbundled means to her. And I think that much of what Zaina is saying there, if you are a faith or religious leader on this at this presentation today, could be really troubling. If you think that Zaina's faith life is static, if you think that 14-year-olds end up having the same faith at 24 and 34 and 54, then you might be very concerned by some of the things that she's saying there about mixing and matching, especially assembling that faith without guides to help her do it. But when we remember that, again, the hallmark of being young is exploration, I think you can let go a little bit of the need to funnel Zaina into the box or the space that you would like her to be immediately, and understand that what she's trying to do is figure all this out, to navigate and find a way through this. And that's important. It means taking young people really seriously, and also understanding that their lives are full of upheaval and change and exploration simultaneously, doing those things together. In practice, then, we see young people engaging in a whole lot of things that rise to the level of spiritual significance to them. Listening to music, spending time with friends, family, caring for pets, and being outdoors, which wouldn't necessarily normally fall into the realm of transcendent behaviors, are often described by young people as those kinds of things. And traditional, quote unquote, traditional things might not. Carrie says, I think I can still believe in God without having to go to church all the time. I don't think going to church is a bad thing, but I don't think it's the end all be all. And we ask young people, specifically, how often did you engage in these kinds of things as religious practice? We saw much higher rates than even I would have guessed. So 53% saying that they're doing art as religious practice, weekly or more often. That 45% say prayer, that makes sense. Reading, which could include, of course, scriptures. Practicing being in nature, also really high, really a paramount concern for young people. Engaging in yoga, martial arts, or other physical activity. We have an article coming out soon with Dr. Barber from the Poor People's Campaign about acts of protest as spiritual activity for young people, and the prevalence with which they engage in acts of protest as religious work. When we ask young people how connected, then, in terms of not just breadth, but depth, how connected do you feel with each of the following, young people who responded moderately or high, feel very connected to the natural environment, more than they feel connected in a deep way to higher power or even to humanistic impulses. But many of them say that they could filter these things through lots of different religions. So half of them say, I feel like I could fit in with many different religions. So leaving aside the, some version of that 53% is of course captured by the number of young people who aren't interested in a religious system at all, with then a very high portion of the remainder who are at least interested in religious systems, thinking like, oh, sure, like I could fit in with a lot of these. And so I think in order to make sense of this, what faith unbundled looks like, I was thinking through like a metaphor, like what what is this sort of conceptual anchor that helps me to understand this? And I think might help a lot of us to understand it. And I think there's a version of the world, maybe one that I grew up in, where the most agency that you could exercise as a young person when it came to your faith was maybe not even attendance, like maybe people were dragging you to church, for example. But you could at least choose whether to accept or reject the system that was being handed to you. This is like going to a restaurant and having the waiter just show up with a plate of food. Your only choice there is I'm either going to eat this food or I'm not going to eat this food. That's basically it. And then there's this other thing that happens where, you know, maybe you get some exposure, some understanding, some opportunities and invitations to encounter other religious systems. And then you might start thinking like, oh, I could be Christian or Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim. So I could pick, like ordering off of a menu, from a lot of different things. And I think there's a whole lot of us that grew up in that world that would hear the thing that Zaina is saying and hear some of these other statements and think that's where young people are, that they're in this menu ordering stage where they're sort of like piecing together and cobbling the thing that they're going to put on. They're going to substitute fries for onion rings, and they're going to somehow emerge with this meal. I'm killing this metaphor to death, right? But you get the idea. But I don't think that's where young people are at. And I think largely because of that community and connection piece, they are in this other place where it's not so much being handed a meal that you can either accept or reject, or ordering something exactly to your specifications. I think where they're actually at is they're at a dinner party. They're at a potluck where they're engaging with each other, trying to, not just each other in real life, each other online, they're engaging with other places of understanding, other ways of connecting with the divine. And then they're like, all of that is turning into a meal where they're trying lots of different things. And some of it they hate, some of it they love, some of it are new combinations of things that people would never have put together before. And I think that's the best way to really wrap your heads around what's going on in the lives of young people with religion. Okay, but you could also just listen to Acadia, because I think she has a very nice way of putting it too.
I think there's like really beautiful idea of if we all are mixing different religions, like however we feel, then we are sharing religion with oftentimes lots of different people, because now we have multiple religions, so we're more connected to other people, and then it creates like a big web of different connections, and then you can talk to people about this part of your religion, but maybe you can talk to your other friend about this other part. So it's a big, like, it's a web instead of just a individual bubble.
I love that idea of it being a web as opposed to an individual bubble where we're all trying to figure these things out together. I love that idea because I think it's really accurate. I think, as she mentions, it's really beautiful, this idea that people trying to help one another figure this out. What this means that for us as adults then, and we've got some other perspectives in the state of religion and young people that you should definitely check out from actual religious professionals from a variety of different settings and faith traditions. But what I see here as somebody who's a researcher is that the overwhelming thing that we can do is to understand that young people are in this process of exploration. Our job is not to provide them with ultimatums. Our job is to stay in the conversation with them for as long as they'll have you. The longer you're in the conversation, the more you can disrupt maybe some of their preconceived ideas, the more that you can help to shape that conversation that they're having, the more that you can build bonds of trust. As we saw last year, trust for institutions is low, trust for relationships is high. Stay in the conversation for as long as they'll let you be there. And I think this really matters. So doing this work is critical, because what we saw this year is that young people who are religious are flourishing a lot more than young people who are not religious. It doesn't seem to matter what their religion is, but it does seem to matter that they have a religious life that is considered. They're flourishing more at work, at home, in their finances, and their health. They're flourishing everywhere. There's a suicide epidemic among young people, and next year in 2022, Springtide is going to be spending the whole year exploring issues of mental health and faith and religion. And at a very basic level, we can already see this data emerging. I generally feel that what I do in my life is valuable and worthwhile. The very religious have a much stronger sense of agreement with that claim. I think showing up in this way for young people is absolutely vital. Before we leave today, I'll say that you can click the link that Sigrid's about to drop into the chat over here. Enter to win five physical copies of The State of Religion and Young People, all about navigating uncertainty. You can stay connected and stay updated with us. We've got a whole bunch of stuff coming out. We've got the podcast, as I mentioned. You can see us on social there. We've got the new normal. It's a free download if you want to guide to connecting with young people in a post-pandemic world. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing screens. We've got a few minutes here. I know I'm sure we've got some questions, right? And so we'll come back and see if we can get to some questions. Oh, look, there's a Q&A feature. And there's questions in it. Darby Callahan says, do you think this issue of disconnect is due to the diverse beliefs among different Christian churches? I don't know, Darby, that's a good question. I mean, Christianity is the largest, of course, religion in the country by adherence, but something like 40% of young people are claiming no religious affiliation. So I don't think that's the only thing that's influencing their thoughts here. I think there are some very vocal and extreme positions in all parts of our society, but religious ones included. The one thing that gives me pause is, and not just making a blanket claim here, is that young people are better and more interested in navigating diversity and holding different ideas in community with one another and other people than any other generation that we've had up to this point. I don't think difference scares them. I don't think it confuses them. I don't think it sends a wishy-washy message to them. I think that it's actually homogeneity that makes them distrust what's going on. United fronts, so to speak, that makes they're sort of inherently skeptical of like, okay, so what's being covered up here? Because they know that diversity is the truth of the world that they inhabit. And so when there's not a diversity of experiences and expressions, I think they get actually more skeptical. Let's see, what else have we got? So we'll save that one. Amy says, if they don't want to walk through the door, I'd love to hear great tactical ideas on ways to encounter them outside of the doors. It's a really good question. I think a lot of the people in this chat might actually have fantastic ideas about that. I'll say this, I think it starts by doing the things that you already do with young people. And if you're not already doing things outside of those doors that engage young people, I think you might want to call into question what you're doing. So one of the stories I tell a lot is of a local ministry here in town, and they ended up building this large indoor skate park that attracts a whole lot of young people. And the lesson from that is not that everybody should become skateboarders. It's that they started this ministry because they were skating with kids. They were skating in public parks and started meeting kids. And like, that's how this whole thing started. It's a local chapter of Youth for Christ. And I think that's probably the right model, that that in the course of doing the things that you're already doing, that you're already doing community service, you're already doing climate change work, or you're already engaging in a Black Lives Matter protest, or any of these other things that young people really care about, or you're already hanging out at the same coffee shops that they're hanging out at, or playing video games with them online in the same places that they are. That's the place to start. And if that has to be manufactured or inauthentic, it probably won't work in the first place, and probably won't have the effect that you're looking for it to have. I think it calls into question the way that we spend a lot of our money, in terms of how much of our budgets are devoted to programming and getting people through the doors, and how much of our budgets are devoted to like coffee or like taking people out to lunch, which I think is maybe a lot more effective way to use those funds. Jeffrey Brassard asks about faith unbundled. Is that the same thing as moralistic therapeutic deism, harkening back to this study that was done by Christian Smith at Notre Dame? And I think the answer there is no. I was never a giant fan of the notion of MTD as the right way to understand young people's faith lives anyway. It felt always incomplete to me. And I think with the fullness of time, not the fullness of time, but the evolution of time since that data was collected nearly 20 years ago now, we start to see why. And I think that's this reliance on community. The connection piece is vital and critical here, and the emergence of new technologies to help facilitate those connections that I think would have been harder to detect when that study was going on is absolutely critical, that young people through and within the context of their own very important identities that might not have always been welcome in faith spaces, they can find communities and other people now who are navigating those same things. And I think that gives fundamentally a different tenor and tone to the kinds of faith questions that they're able to ask and explore and answer with one another. So I don't think it's this. We didn't see that same sort of the therapeutic component of this nearly in the same way that Christian Smith found that God is just there to solve your problems. In fact, for many of them, the connection to others in different spaces was more challenging. Like the divine is challenging to them in the way that they live their lives, and the things that they feel, I'll use a very Christian term here, feel very called to do in life. We're not always comfortable things. Sorry, I'm not going to get to all these, so I'm going to pick some of them that see. Sorry says, I'm curious to know what young people are saying about their images of God or the divine rather than institution. I am too, sorry, and I'm going to clip out this question because we're talking to some funders here very soon about doing a project explicitly asking young people to engage that question in a variety of different ways. What is sacred space to you? What does God look like in your head, or in real life? How do you know the divine when you see it? I'm curious about all these kinds of things. I don't think anybody really knows the answer to those things just yet. I love all these questions. These have been super. I've seen so many things over in the chat too, which is really great. One of the things that Springtide is really hoping to do over the course of the next 12 months is start bringing more people together who are interested in these same kinds of topics, who are doing really great work with young people. We know and feel confident about the data that we have. We understand that the frameworks are representative of what young people are telling us, whether that's relational authority or if it's the belongingness process of notice, name, known, or this idea of faith unbundled. But the actual answers for what that looks like in real life about how you engage with young people, those are over with you people. I say over because your chat is on my other screen over here. And I'm fascinated to dig in more to those and to let you all get to talk with, I know you can talk to each other, but we're hoping that Springtide can be part of the conduit for that conversation to happen, because I think it's a really vital one as we reimagine and rethink a lot of how we do religious connection and engagement with young people. I want to say thank you all for showing up here in the middle of the day on a Thursday to help, to learn more about young people. And at Springtide, my promise is that we're going to keep doing the best job that we can do to accurately portray and reflect back what we're hearing from them. Please do, join us on the website, listen to the podcast, make sure that you sign up for the challenge to get the 5 free copies. And if you want to engage with us on social media, that would be great. We're at We Are Springtide. I'm at Dr. Josh Packard, DrJoshPackard on Twitter. So I'd love to see you over there as well. Thanks so much, everyone. I hope to hear from you soon and see you soon.